Good evening, or good morning, or good afternoon to all. It is a great honor to be presenting in the National Library of Israel's Reading Room series. And I only regret, of course, that we're not actually in the reading room together in Jerusalem, especially since I heard that the reading room has just reopened today, if I understand correctly. Um, and it's fitting that I'm sharing this talk with you through the platform of the National Library, since my time researching at the NLI was essential to my project, and so many of the examples I'm going to show you are in fact held in the collection of the National Library. This talk emerges from my research in book history, focusing on the Jewish communities of North Africa, known as the Maghreb in Arabic, in the early modern and modern periods. I want to explore four aspects of 19th century Maghrebi print culture with you. First, the relationship of North African Jewish communities with Hebrew printing presses overseas, mostly in Italy and the Ottoman Empire. Second, the growth of a local printing industry in the Maghreb and the new genres it supported. And finally, third, the movement of books within Maghrebi reading communities. And finally, what studying book culture helps us see about Maghrebi Jewish society in this time of transition. Before we dive into the material, I want to begin by reflecting on what I mean when I talk about book history. Book history refers to a field of study that is not just history, but a multidisciplinary combination of history, art, sociology, literary, and textual studies, all brought together to understand the book as an object. And this is very familiar to some of you, I know, and so review, and for others, this is entry into a new way of thinking about books. Two scholars in the field, Simon Elliott and Jonathan Rose, define the field of book history as being based on the following two premises. First, that books make history. In other words, books and their changing technologies of production have effects on society. We could think about how the printing press contributed to transformations like the Protestant Reformation. We could look at the role of literature and journalism in the French Revolution. Books are one of the primary tools that people use to transmit ideas, record memories, create narratives, and exercise power. So they have this large historical weight. So that's the first core premise of book history. The second premise is that books are made by history. That is, they're shaped by the economic, political, social, and cultural forces around them. The content, the physical form, the material appearance, and the public and private reactions that books receive are all dictated by their social and historical context. So this is what we mean when we say book history. And another scholar, D.F. Mackenzie, calls book history the sociology of texts, understanding how texts take on social lives through their material forms. So to begin, I want to emphasize that Sephardi printing in the early modern period was part of a vast and robust system of overlapping social networks. Jews looking to print books traveled to places where they had well-established commercial and social ties and where Hebrew printing was flourishing, places like Salonika, Constantinople, Livorno, and Amsterdam. The constant flow of people to those presses, in turn, reinforced the links that had brought them there. So while there were no Hebrew presses in North Africa until the second half of the 19th century, with two exceptions that I don't have time to get into now, but I'm happy to talk about in the question period, but leaving those two, and if you know what they are, you can smile to yourself. But leaving those two exceptions aside, there were really no Hebrew presses in North Africa until the 1860s or 70s. But nonetheless, Maghrebi Jews were already very familiar with the work of printing as authors, editors, publishers, correctors, and other print professionals. They often went to great lengths to bring manuscripts to print, whether it was their own books or precious manuscripts that they had inherited from their ancestors, sometimes going back to the Middle Ages. In many cases, North African Jews found themselves pressed into work as correctors and editors at presses, dealing with North African manuscripts, simply due to their ability to read the manuscript being printed. As some of you know quite well, North African Hebrew cursive can be a formidable challenge to decipher, and many Italian and Ashkenazi printers found it completely incomprehensible. So just to give you one example, the wandering Moroccan Kabbalist Moshe Edrei, or Moses Edrei, happened to be in Amsterdam in 1807 when a group of Jews from Meknes arrived with a manuscript of liturgical poetry by David ibn Hassin, and they were hoping to have it printed. But none of the printers could read the handwriting. And I've given you, this isn't the manuscript that was used, but this is another early 19th century manuscript of David ibn Hassin. And this is a neat, I mean, take a look at that handwriting. This is a clear and neat kind of handwriting for those who know how to read it. And for those who don't, you can imagine that this is very difficult to typeset. So Edrei ended up editing it, and in his introduction to the resulting volume, Teila David, Edrei explains that he was tasked with editing it since he was the only one able to read its Moroccan handwriting. And as you see here, he writes, "How much work did I labor in editing this book, for it was written in a manuscript many years old, but the heavy labor was mine alone, for there was no one else who was able to read this script besides myself, since it is the script of my homeland." Ki hu ktav moladati, he says. Starting in the 1740s, one Italian city in particular emerged as a world center for Jewish book production, and that's the port city of Livorno, or sometimes called Leghorn, in western Tuscany. Livornese Jewish families maintained long-standing economic and personal ties throughout northern and southern Europe, the Levant, North Africa, and even as far as South Asia. Clusters of diaspora Livornese communities were especially prominent in Tunis, Algiers, Tetuan, Alexandria, Salonika, Aleppo, and Izmir. There was also a large Maghrebi diaspora living in Livorno itself. By the end of the 18th century, North African Jews comprised some 13% of the Jewish community of Livorno and 43% of the Jewish commercial firms of the city. So there were very, very close and mutually reinforcing ties between the Jews of North Africa and the Jews of Livorno. North African Jews soon formed a large portion of clients commissioning and bringing to press Hebrew books in Livorno. Several printing firms, like the presses of Castello and Saadoun, especially Salomone Belforte, focused their marketing attention on North African communities, producing large numbers of books destined for the Maghreb, not only in Hebrew, but also in Judeo-Spanish and especially Judeo-Arabic. Just to give you one example, an analysis of all the books written by Algerian Jewish scholars, which were printed outside of Algeria between 1600 and 1900, I'm using the statistics according to the bibliography of Eliyahu Rafael Marziano. So if you take all of those books, 75% of them were printed in Livorno. And this statistic is even more impressive when one takes into account that the Hebrew printing industry in Livorno was only active starting in 1750. So for only half the period of time under discussion, was it able to print books in Livorno, and nonetheless, it soon took over a very large share of the market. Livorno's prominence as a center for Sephardi printing continued in the 1800s and even into the 1900s, even while a local printing industry emerged in North Africa in the second half of the 19th century, which we'll get to in a few minutes. The wealthy Tunisian Jewish leader Nissim Shamama, for example, financed the printing of a dozen different books published at presses in Livorno between the 1830s and the 1880s. The work of Livornese printing houses also served as a way for the Maghrebi diaspora living in Livorno or elsewhere to remain connected to their compatriots and family on the other shore of the Mediterranean. In this example, two Tunisians living in Livorno wrote the following in the preface to a Judeo-Arabic manual on the laws of shchita, of kosher slaughter, that they published in Livorno in 1873. And you see the quote here. They wrote, "Even though we are now living in a foreign country, happy and successful, our eyes are raised to our ancestral land, where we were born, where our ancestors are buried, and where our elders still dwell. To show everyone that we have not forgotten them, we decided to print this book for the benefit of our brethren, especially those who speak only Arabic. We will conclude by saying to you, dear brethren, that even if we are far from you, our hearts still cling to you, and we thank God whenever we hear glad tidings from you." There were many differences, linguistic, cultural, religious, and political, that separated Sitruk and Shamama in the Kingdom of Italy from their friends and family in the Ottoman, what was at the time the Ottoman Beylik of Tunis. But from the perspective of the books, that they were making and reading, they saw themselves as part of the same community. Undertaking the labor to create a book, a printed book in Livorno, they asserted that even though they were in a foreign country, they still belonged to North Africa. One 19th century Livornese firm in particular was not only a supplier of Maghrebi Jewish books, but founded by a publisher of Maghrebi origin himself. And that's the press of Elia ben Amozeg, or Eliyahu ben Amozeg. Elia ben Amozeg was born in Livorno in 1823 to Moroccan parents. His first involvement in the world of Livornese publishing was contributing a preface to his uncle Avraham Koryat's book of Kabbalistic essays, Ma'or V'Shemesh, which was printed in 1839, so he was just a teenager. As a young man, Ben Amozeg edited a number of books working at the press of Salomone Belforte, and then he established his own printing house in 1852, which he ran until his death in 1900. And this press was one of the most prolific Hebrew presses of Livorno. It produced some 163 titles, a tenth of all Hebrew books printed in Livorno between the 17th and 20th centuries. Now, Ben Amozeg may be well known to some of you for his work as an author, philosopher, and biblical commentator. Maybe some of you have read Clémence Boulouc's excellent new book on Ben Amozeg. But I want to focus here on his work as a publisher. The majority of titles produced by his press were either scholarly works by Maghrebi rabbis or liturgical works aimed at a Maghrebi audience, and I'd like to highlight a few especially important initiatives. One of Ben Amozeg's very first publications, appearing in 1854, was Or Ne'arav, a Judeo-Arabic translation of the Torah produced by and for the North African market. The translator was a Moroccan rabbi named Michael Makhlouf Aloun, born in Marrakesh in 1795, who had trained as a rabbi and a sofer, also a shochet, and he had served as a rabbinic emissary in Italy since 1817. Aloun writes that his goal was specifically to create a clear, modern translation that could serve to educate young Jews across the Arabic-speaking world. And he writes in the preface, I quote, "Since we have seen now that there are many in the Arab world whose tongues thirst for nourishment, but their language goes from land to land, this one speaking this way, that one speaking that way, and the land is churned up, each one reading according to their own custom." End quote. This translation, therefore, aims to create a new, standardized Judeo-Arabic rendering to replace the local traditions of vernacular translation, known as sharh, which differed from country to country and even from city to city. We might compare this initiative to the kinds of modern Jewish German translations of the Bible championed by Maskilim in Europe, like Moses Mendelssohn and Yoel Brill, as enlightened replacements for the debased, old-fashioned jargon of Yiddish. So there's a kind of similar thing happening, I would argue, here with Aloun. But while Aloun emphasizes that he hopes, and again I quote, "this translation may find favor for all our Jewish brethren, whether living in the Levant, Egypt, and Syria, or in the Maghreb, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco," he also explains that he has followed the orthographic system, which is, and again I quote, "how the ancient Jews in Arab lands would write, according to the principles of the Arabic language, as anyone can see in the old manuscripts which I have, and which is still followed to this day in the lands of Morocco and the lands of Algeria." End quote. What I see here is that Or Ne'arav attempts to balance between its universalizing reach and its repudiation of local vernaculars on the one hand, and its emergence from and rootedness in the North African tradition on the other. While Aloun is attempting to standardize and modernize the Torah's Judeo-Arabic renderings, he also is committed to his native Maghrebi dialect as closest to the oldest and most authoritative forms of Arabic. Beyond liturgical and biblical books, Ben Amozeg's press also published the work of a number of Sephardi and Maghrebi intellectuals who were composing contemporary responses to the changing world around them. Through the work of his press, Ben Amozeg helped promote a Mediterranean Sephardi intellectual world, publishing the works of Sephardi thinkers in North Africa and beyond, who were engaged in complex negotiations with modern ideas. These include figures like Yitzhak ben Walid of Tetuan, Eliyahu Bechor Chazan of Tripoli and then later Alexandria, and Shlomo Bechor Chutzin of Baghdad. These writers grappled with issues like secular education, civil marriage, the impact of technologies like electricity and railroads and telegraph, as well as with ideological and theological questions about interreligious contact, the relationship of religion and science, feminism, Zionism, nationalism, and more. In addition, Ben Amozeg also began to produce examples of secular Judeo-Arabic reading material. In his later career, Ben Amozeg was at the forefront of the newly forming world of popular Judeo-Arabic printing, alongside his colleague Israel Costa in Livorno. Between 1884 and 1885, Ben Amozeg published a newspaper in Tunisian Judeo-Arabic titled Hamevasser, or Al-Mubashir in Arabic, edited by the Tunisian writer Eliezer Farhi. And Farhi, as we'll hear in a moment, went on to play a significant role in the development of the Judeo-Arabic press in Tunis, but his entry into the world of Judeo-Arabic publishing was through his work in Livorno with Ben Amozeg. In 1885, Ben Amozeg published Farhi's first literary work, which you see on the left, Anis al-Wujud, a collection of short stories from Jewish history in Tunisian Judeo-Arabic. It's actually a collaboration between Farhi and another figure, Moshe Shamama, who himself translated the Tunisian constitution into Judeo-Arabic, printed 2 decades earlier in Tunis, and we'll see that in a moment. In 1886, Ben Amozeg also published a number of issues of an Algerian Judeo-Arabic newspaper, Or Halevana, written by Shalom Bechash, which shared stories of geography and history from Jewish and non-Jewish communities around the world. The third issue, for instance, features, among others, a long story from Ibn Verga's Shevet Yehuda, articles on the Jewish communities of China and Singapore, and even a description of the Dalai Lama, which you see here. So if you ever wondered how to say Dalai Lama in Judeo-Arabic, the answer is Dalai Lama. Not particularly exciting, but still interesting nonetheless. Bechash, who was actually himself an Indian-born Baghdadi rabbi and maskil, who spent most of his life in Algeria, went on, like Farhi, to establish his own Judeo-Arabic printing press in Algiers, where he continued to publish a wide variety of texts. So Elia Ben Amozeg, while he himself was thoroughly immersed in the Italian and Sephardi Jewish communities of Livorno, and indeed he actually never traveled farther than Pisa out of the city, the works that he produced in his printing press and the books that he sold in his bookstore point to his commitment to fostering an Arabophone Mediterranean Jewish modernity and his commitment to supporting colleagues who would go on to play important roles in the development of Judeo-Arabic printing in North Africa. So that brings us to the development of the North African printing industry in the second half of the 19th century. The first printer to produce books in Hebrew characters in the Maghreb in the modern period, again, there's 2 examples that I'm sort of skipping over, was the Shaliach Chaim Zev Ashkenazi, who arrived in North Africa from Jerusalem in the 1840s and printed a commentary on Nazir in Algiers in 1853, along with the book of Havdalah, which you see here on the left. He sold his press the following year to 2 brothers from the local community, Chaim and Yaakov Kohen Shulal, or Kohen Solal in French, who continued printing. Meanwhile, Ashkenazi moved to Oran, where he printed some liturgical books in 1856, and then again sold his press to a local family in Oran, the Karsentis, Nisim and Eli Karsenti. Finally, he then moved to Tunis, where in 1861 he printed the Judeo-Arabic translation that I mentioned earlier, the Ahd al-Aman, or Fundamental Pact, which is the precursor to the first Tunisian constitution. You see it here on the right. And again, of course, in the National Library. The translator of this book, Moshe Shamama, was unusually highly educated in classical Arabic and served not only as an Arabic instructor, but also as a legal agent in the Beylikal Wazara court. And Shamama, as we heard later, collaborated with Eliezer Farhi to publish a number of literary texts in Judeo-Arabic. In the preface to this constitution, he explains, and I quote, "I saw that the language of the Ahd al-Aman was difficult to understand, and in particular, many of our Jewish brethren do not read in Arabic script. Therefore, I have translated it into the local Maghrebi Arabic that is commonly spoken among the people, so that all our Jewish brethren will be able to understand and learn the foundations of this fundamental act." Over the following 5 decades and into the 20th century, these presses and others produced an incredible variety of material in Hebrew and Judeo-Arabic, books, booklets, ephemera, some familiar kinds of writing, responsa, sermons, commentaries, exegesis, and some in new genres, journalism, literature, drama, and science. These included translations of European and Hebrew works into Judeo-Arabic, such as Dumas' Le Comte de Monte Cristo, Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, which you see in the center, Avraham Mapu's Hebrew novel Ahavat Zion, and original compositions in Judeo-Arabic, such as Eliezer Farhi's novel Sirat Zinat Tamam, which was published in Tunis in 1888. Many writers saw Judeo-Arabic publishing not only as working in the shared vernacular language, but as part of creating a modern Judeo-Arabic reading public, a project, an ideological project, which had already begun some decades earlier with the Maghrebi writers working with Jewish presses in Livorno, as we already saw. Already in 1870, when Nissim Benisti published the first Maghrebi Jewish newspaper, which you see on the left, a short-lived, admittedly, bilingual French and Judeo-Arabic journal titled Adziri, or L'Israélite Algérien, it described itself as, and I quote from the header, a commercial, industrial, agricultural, maritime, literary, scientific, judicial, and advertising journal. And its first Judeo-Arabic headline declared in large letters, reform, emancipation, and progress. So the Judeo-Arabic language here in this publication is promoted as a competent equal to French, equally able to express all the needs of modernity in all its commercial, industrial, agricultural, maritime, and scientific facets. In the 1890s, Tunis emerged as a center for Hebrew and Judeo-Arabic publishing, eventually overtaking Algiers and even Livorno. The presses of Eliezer Farhi, Yaakov Gej, and especially Uzan and Castro churned out an explosion of Jewish books, mostly small booklets of popular literature in vernacular Judeo-Arabic. In his 1907 catalog of Tunisian Jewish publishing, the French scholar Euseb Vassel listed over 500 such bibliographic items, all printed in Tunis since 1880 until 1907. They range in genre from plays and stories to cookbooks and manuals on dream interpretation. The availability of a local print industry had opened the possibility of printing small-scale and ephemeral material, much of which has not survived, or if it has not been properly studied or even cataloged. So I want to talk just for a minute about ephemera. Ephemera are often marginalized by book historians who prefer to study real books that have title pages and clear authors and dates of printing. But ephemera, I would argue, is central, or are central, to understanding the landscape of printing and book culture, both from the side of the customers and from the side of the presses producing it. Ephemera and so-called job printing, printing small things on demand, was the economic backbone of almost all printing presses. You can see this just from examples of advertisements for presses when they list the things they produce in their press, as Yaakov Gej does in his advertisement here from 1888. He emphasizes we can produce books and journals, letters, envelopes, business cards, address cards, leaflets, or brochures. In other words, 90% of what he's claiming to produce here are what we would call ephemera. It's not only economic filler to support the more expensive book projects. Ephemera also provided clients with personalized printed material like stationery, invitations, and cards, with the ability to share news and community announcements widely, and with cheap, plentiful, and constantly changing reading material in the form of pamphlets, song booklets, feuilletons, and other material. Amidst this active, fluid, and burgeoning print culture, Maghrebi writers and intellectuals attempted to tackle the political, social, and religious questions of the day. The production of the Judeo-Arabic presses of Tunis, in particular, in this respect, has been comprehensively studied by Yosef and Sivia Toby, so I won't repeat all their work here. I'll just direct you to their excellent book in Hebrew or in English on Judeo-Arabic literature in Tunisia. In the meantime, I would like to offer just an interesting comparative example from Algiers. In 1884, Mordechai Tzoror published a collection of stories in Algerian Judeo-Arabic called Kol Sasson. He explained in the introduction that he is explicitly concerned with strengthening the textual presence of Judeo-Arabic against French. As he writes, and I quote, "In order to expand their minds, people today buy the novels of the stories of the Christians, the romans in French, and the many people who buy the journals do so not to see the news in them, but so that they can read the stories in them printed as feuilleton. Therefore, I have made this book in Arabic so that everyone can study the stories of the miracles and wonders that the Holy Blessed One has done for our ancestors in every generation. And it is good in the winter days, when the nights are long, for a man to sit and study these stories with his family, so that all the women, too, will know the power of the Holy Blessed One." Saror portrays the use of Judeo-Arabic as an essential element of Jewish identity, one that could reach the masses and bring them back towards the heart of traditional Jewish morality, away from the temptations of secular French culture. French, however, was also linked to the power and prestige of European modernity. Indeed, some Maghrebi Jews, including many of the same figures who lauded the value of Judeo-Arabic over French, including Saror himself, as we'll see in a moment, also pursued the social and intellectual advantages that the French language could bring. So I don't want to set up a binary of, it's Judeo-Arabic against French. The landscape at the time was more blurred and more nuanced than that. People are using Judeo-Arabic and Hebrew and French at different times for different purposes. Saror's publisher, an Algerian printer and bookseller named Avraham Boukabza, published a catalog of his press in 1886. You see it on the right. Unfortunately, I have been unable to locate this catalog. There is, to my knowledge, one surviving copy, this copy that you see. It was sold at Kedem auction in 2010 to a book dealer. If you have seen it, please let me know. Like a wanted poster. Have you seen this catalog? If you have seen an 1886 catalog of Judeo-Arabic books from Algeria, please let me know immediately. It is number one on the wanted list. So I've been unable to find this catalog, which would really tell us a lot, but I have been able to reconstruct through surviving advertisements about a quarter of Boukabza's inventory in the period, because he prints little book lists in other books that he publishes. So we can see that he sold liturgical books, a variety of Bibles, prayer books in large and small editions, works of classical rabbinic law and commentary, collected sermons from local rabbis, Hebrew books of the Haskalah. He also sold vernacular Judeo-Arabic material, religious digests like Pachegan HaKtav, which is a Judeo-Arabic translation of the Judeo-Spanish book Me'am Lo'ez, books of folk tales, divination manuals, Judeo-Arabic newspapers, serialized novellas, and finally, printed amulets and also items of ritual Judaica like talitot and tefillin. Boukabza and Saror eventually joined forces with Shalom Bechash, the Iraqi rabbi whom I mentioned earlier. Bechash's son, Yosef Chaim, began working with them as a typesetter, and by 1890, the Bechash family had taken over the press. And Shalom Bechash, continued to produce Judeo-Arabic material there. All of these Judeo-Arabic compositions, the original works and translations of history and geography, testify to the wide horizons of interest for Maghrebi Jews and the worldwide scope of their social and political relationships, a diaspora that stretched across the Mediterranean and beyond, and an interest in and a solidarity with Jewish communities around the world. The variety of literary material, including classical Arabic folk tales, original Judeo-Arabic compositions, and translations of literary and scientific works from Hebrew and European languages, demonstrates the cultural vitality of Judeo-Arabic readers and their engagement with the cultural questions of the time. And the fact that these same presses and many of the same writers also published books of Hebrew and Judeo-Arabic liturgy and halakha, and Judeo-Arabic works of morality and ideology aimed at combating assimilation, speaks to the complex position of Maghrebi Jewish thinkers, writers, printers, who were all negotiating their own path towards a Judeo-Arabic modernity. And this is one of the aspects that I think distinguishes the form of modernizing Jewish movements like the Haskalah in North Africa, in contrast to their expression in Europe. I'm drawing on many other scholars here, who argue that rather than a largely secular and even anti-religious movement, the figures in North Africa and the Middle East who promoted the Maskilic ideals of modernization and emancipation were also invested themselves in supporting Jewish communal and religious identity, and were often rabbis and religious leaders. However, the French language was also making rapid inroads among the Jewish communities of the Maghreb in the second half of the 19th century, thanks both to the expansion of the French colonial presence and to the educational system of the Franco-Jewish philanthropic organization, l'Alliance Israélite Universelle, or the AIU. In particular, the AIU's emphasis on education for girls had an especially strong effect on literacy among Maghrebi Jewish women. We already heard from Paul Sasson that Saror assumed that men would buy the book and read it aloud in the house. In other words, he assumed that women would not be able to read it for themselves. But Maghrebi Jewish women were becoming increasingly literate in French, which began to have an impact on local print culture. For example, an 1887 advertisement for an Algerian Passover Haggadah, published by Boukhabza with French translation by none other than Mordechai Saror, who has Gallicized his name here to the very French-sounding Martin Saror. In the advertisement for this Haggadah, Boukhabza explains, and I quote, "We have printed a new Haggadah for Passover, translated into French, since women are obligated in the reading of the Haggadah, but the women of our time do not know how to read in the Hebrew alphabet. So we have done it all in French. We hope that everyone who buys this Haggadah takes great pleasure on the night of the Seder, whether he understands it all or whether it is his sons or daughters who know how to read it in French." And although Maghrebi Jewish women did not publish their own writing until the early 20th century, as far as I'm aware, and again, I would love to be corrected on this point, but to my knowledge, no Maghrebi Jewish women were publishing books or articles before the 1900s. But when they did start publishing in the early 1920s, all of those first literary efforts were in French. Already in 1910, Nahum Slush noted that and I quote, "The Gallicizing process has gone forward rapidly, and the new generation, industrious and alive, is rapidly throwing off the Arab influence, although the older people still cling to their Judeo-Arabic literature." In some areas like Tunis, printers began to produce Judeo-Arabic works accompanied by a transliteration in Latin letters, as you see here on the right, indicating that perhaps some Jews were able to understand Judeo-Arabic, but preferred to read it in Latin letters rather than in Hebrew script. Many of the Jewish presses turned to producing larger numbers of works in French, and the number of Judeo-Arabic publications continued to decline as the number of Jewish intellectuals writing in French increased. While some presses continued to operate well into the 20th century, the bulk of their production shifted into French and Hebrew. I have one final aspect of print culture to discuss, and that is what happened after these books left the printing press. Already in the early 19th century, and even earlier, of course, the book trade was a vibrant economic connection between Jewish communities in the Maghreb and abroad, in both directions. Travelers and emissaries would bring manuscripts from North Africa to presses in Italy and the Ottoman Empire, and they would bring back printed books in return. We can see one example of this through the Pinkas, or the record book of David Atias, an emissary from Meknes who left Morocco in 1821 to raise funds in Western Europe and North America. Among his records of donations and expenses, he recorded a number of lists of books which he was bringing back to Morocco. 2 lists of the books which I have in storage, which I brought from Livorno to Gibraltar through Mr. Aharon Cardozo, and another list, again, quote, "the books which I have among my books at the lodging house at the Customs House of London," and he spells out in Judeo-Arabic, "fi Customs House," which I bought in Amsterdam. The 61 books listed by Atias here include several multi-volume sets of the Tanakh, prayer books of various sizes, and a number of books in Judeo-Spanish, indicating to me, since he was obviously a Judeo-Arabic speaker, that he was probably transporting books on behalf of others, either specific individuals or intending to sell them. Having already made their way from their various places of printing to the shipping centers of London and Gibraltar, the books were sent to Morocco and dispersed into libraries and collections. Many rabbis and scholars in the Maghreb boasted of large libraries, built up over a number of generations, which served as public or semi-public communal resources and spaces for encounter, dialogue, and intellectual inquiry. These libraries encompassed medieval manuscripts, contemporary manuscript books written in North Africa, and printed books, both old and new. For example, one surviving catalog of a 19th century rabbinic library from Fez actually indicates where each book was shelved in the library. And from that, we can see, again, just to pick a shelf more or less at random, shelf 4 contained books of Talmudic commentary printed in Sulzbach in the 1700s, a manuscript copy of sermons from an 18th century Moroccan rabbi, a 1593 Constantinople printing, a book of sermons printed in Livorno in 1821, and hot off the presses, the Khatam Sofer's commentary on the Torah, which must have been quite new because this list cannot be later than 1883. And they're all literally right next to each other, on the shelf. To take another example, the library of the 19th century Algerian rabbi Moïse Sebaoun, which was studied by the late scholar Gerard Nahon, was well stocked with important rabbinic works produced at Hebrew presses in Italy, the Ottoman Empire, Germany, France, the Netherlands, and Poland, with 35 cities represented in total, and its oldest books dating as far back as 1518. But I also want to emphasize that the geographic diversity of the book's origins should not obscure the intellectual centrality of the Sephardi world. In Sebaoun's library, for example, over half the books were authored by Sephardi scholars in North Africa and the Ottoman Empire, with an additional 15% contributed by European Sephardi authors, such as those of Italy or Amsterdam. Thus, the books that traveled from Amsterdam to Morocco with David Attias, for example, were actually making the return half of a journey that had brought them from the Maghreb to Europe in earlier decades, or sometimes even centuries, in manuscript. Their presence in Maghrebi libraries demonstrates how North Africa was integrated into long-standing transnational networks that moved people, ideas, and objects back and forth in multiple directions. These family libraries were open to scholars, rabbis, and intellectuals who traveled to consult the rare books held there, often for multiple generations in a row. The correspondence of Moroccan rabbis is filled with requests for books, offers to sell books, notes about new books, expressions of gratitude for the resources shared in their libraries. We also know that many individuals gave money to support communal libraries or donated their own books to that end. One inventory of the library of the Eitz Chaim Yeshiva in Tunis, which was done at the end of the 19th century, shows that in addition to the 129 volumes owned by the yeshiva, the library also housed some 15 private collections belonging to individuals, which were kept in the yeshiva, quote, in order for students to learn from them. So these libraries were not static repositories or dusty graveyards of old books, but mobile sites of conversation and knowledge transmission. Medieval manuscripts sat alongside printed books in living libraries, which served as meeting places for scholars and birthplaces for new textual creations that gathered, reworked, expanded, and transformed their contents. Books did not only live in grand rabbinic libraries, however, but also in families and small communities, among people gathered around a table to listen to a book being read aloud, or parents passing down a single precious tome to their children. In that respect, then, I would like to close with one final encounter with the Jewish book in North Africa, recorded on a tattered scrap of paper now held at Yale University. In the winter of 1879, a Moroccan Jewish woman named Nuna, the widow of a certain Yehuda Kohen Adib, purchased a set of the Babylonian Talmud for the benefit of her local community in Debdu, a town in eastern Morocco not far from the Algerian border. To be more precise, she dedicated the sum of 30 duros for the purpose and appointed the scholar Moshe ben Shlomo bar Malil to travel to Oran to acquire the books. This is already unusual. As I noted a few minutes ago, the majority of Maghrebi Jewish women in this period were not literate in Hebrew and had little direct engagement with the world of rabbinic literature epitomized by the Talmud. Now, it is true that Nuna's late husband was from a well-respected scholarly family. The Adib family is well known of Debdu. We might surmise that Nuna was also known for her piety and learning. There is one other legal document from Debdu which mentions a hekdesh, or dedicated property like the Islamic waqf, of Nuna, which almost certainly refers to the same woman. But still, while many Moroccan Jewish women were involved in creating and dedicating ritual items to synagogues, curtains, mantles, and other such things, it is still remarkable to find a woman involved in the purchasing and dedication of rabbinic books, the Talmud, even if she had no ability or intention of reading the books herself. Now, our document does not specify why the books were purchased in Oran, but they were certainly not produced there. No edition of the Talmud was ever printed in Algeria, and I'm assuming that the volumes of the Talmud we're talking about are in print. If we're talking about a manuscript Talmud, then there's no reason to travel to Oran when you could copy the Talmud right there in Debdu. One especially intriguing possibility is that Nuna and her friends were perhaps aware of the newly announced printing of the famed Vilna Shas edition of the Talmud, which was printed by the press of another widow, the widow and brothers Rom, and there was a call to subscribers released quite widely in the fall of 1879. The first volumes appeared in early 1880. So that's one possibility. It's also possible, of course, that Bar Malil was tasked with purchasing whatever volumes of the Talmud he could find, and that he bought an older edition of the Talmud in Oran, perhaps one even previously used. So in any case, the journey of these books from Oran to Debdu was only the last leg of a voyage which must have begun thousands of miles away, and if Bar Malil was purchasing secondhand books, perhaps decades or even centuries before. In the legal document that was drawn up at the time, that you see here, it is specified that the majority of the volumes will be held in Nuna's physical possession. Again, an exceptional circumstance for Maghrebi Jewish women, and that priority access to the books will be granted to the brothers of her deceased husband and their children, to Moshe Bar Malil, Moshe's brother Yaakov and their children, and all their inheritors after them, to study these books ad sof kol hadorot, until the end of all generations. Now, I don't know whether these volumes of Nuna's were part of a personal or family collection, or whether they were simply stored at her house for practical reasons. In any case, this modest library of Nuna's is a far cry from the celebrated library of Rabbi Moïse Sebaoun, with its thousands and thousands of ancient and modern volumes. But for all their differences, these two encounters with the Jewish book in North Africa nonetheless tell a similar story. A story about the movement of books as material objects across borders, between communities, and within families, and a story about the importance of books as social objects embedded in the lives and relationships of Jewish communities in North Africa. Libraries and books served, as they do today, not only as sites of individual research and reading, but also as facilitators of encounter, discussion, and expansion. These conversations connected Jewish communities in North Africa as both readers and writers to Jewish communities across the Mediterranean and beyond, integrating them into a global world of Jewish books. I can think of no better tribute to the work of the National Library of Israel, which stands today not only as one of the foremost repositories of Jewish culture, but as an exemplar of the library's mission to cultivate dialogue. So it's an honor to join my voice to that conversation. I will stop there. I welcome all your questions and thoughts on the topic.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sienna. I'm not going to be reading the questions in chronological order because there's some that I want to ask first, so I apologize also to those who are going to skip over. In any case, the first question I'd like to ask was asked by Mira, and she asked, what led you to this research?
It's a great question. I can actually show you here on my shelf. So my father, who actually is here on the call, worked in Morocco in the 1970s as a volunteer for the American Joint Distribution Committee, or the JDC. And he acquired a number of books. I'll just pull one out here, such as this one. sort of used books printed in Livorno, but of North African provenance, that people had in attics and were giving away. And so he took them. And I sort of found them as a child and was completely captivated by the story of these books, where they came from, who had written in them, who had read them, who had used them. And so I always had this idea in the back of my mind that I would be able to discover, the story of these books, which were so intriguing to me as a child. And then as I was pursuing my dissertation research, so my doctorate is in history and Jewish history and museum studies. And so I was thinking, what can I use that would bring those fields together, thinking about objects that can tell historical stories through their material history. And I thought, well, what better object than a book? A book, tells stories in so many different ways, both through the texts that are in it, but also through the ways that it moves as an object between communities. And I was particularly interested in the Jewish communities of North Africa. And so it all fell together: Jews, North Africa, book, history, materiality. So that's, it came together like in one night. I just woke up and I thought, oh, I have the idea for my dissertation. And it just, it grew from there.
Thank you very much. Hillel asked kind of a technical question, but what is the dot on the top of the chaf on the left? I think he's referring to the second text of Judeo-Arabic writing. And then this question continues, is that like the rafeh or other kinds of diacritic? Same for the pays and the tzadiks.
Sure. Yeah, so I'll say a little bit about Judeo-Arabic orthography, which I even alluded to when I was talking about Orne Arav. It's something that Judeo-Arabic writers themselves thought and argued about quite a bit, how to represent Judeo-Arabic in Hebrew letters, like Yiddish or Judeo-Spanish or any other Jewish language. Judeo-Arabic is a dialect that is written phonetically in Hebrew script, but it's a non-Hebrew language. In this case, it's a dialect of Arabic. So there are sounds in Arabic that are not represented by the Hebrew alphabet. So you have to figure out how to represent them. So the ghayin, the bod, the difference between sod and dod. So for Judeo-Arabic, jim and chayin. So for Judeo-Arabic, the general agreement is that the letter kaf represents kaf, the Arabic letter kaf. With a dot over it, it represents cha, the cha letter. The tzadi by itself represents the Arabic letter sod. It's a little bit easier than Yiddish because Arabic and Hebrew are in fact related. So there is a like the letter sod is etymologically the same as the letter tzadi in Hebrew. The dot with the tzadi is dod, which is again borrowing from Arabic orthography. The dod in Arabic is a sod with a dot on it. The only unusual thing that trips me up is okay. So there are three letters. Okay, in Arabic there's the letter jim, which is etymologically the same as the gimel. Then there's the letter ayin, which is ayin, and ghayin, which is written with a dot over the ayin to make ghayin. In Judeo-Arabic, however, especially in North African Judeo-Arabic, they chose to represent the letter ghayin not with a dot on the ayin, but with a dot on the gimel. However, they also use a dot on the gimel to represent jim. So when you're reading Judeo-Arabic printed text, you'll sometimes find a gimel with no dot, sometimes with a dot over it, and sometimes with a dot under it. One of those is going to be jim, and another one is going to be ghayin, but you never know which one is which until you're reading the text because there was no agreed upon standard orthography. So different printers and different publishers had different standards about is the jim over dot or under dot, which one, so you have to sort of read it and think like, this word could be jalsa or it could be ghalsa. So, what is it? So you have to kind of figure it out as you go. But one of the things that, Judeo-Arabic orthography is interesting to pay attention to is thinking about, the printers who are more or less familiar. I think one of the reasons why Ben Amozeg, for example, was so popular is that he probably had some familiarity with Judeo-Arabic himself. I don't have 100% proof, but I suspect that he spoke Judeo-Arabic himself, and certainly the other North African Jews in Livorno who worked with him did. And his press, had a fine, they really had a well-oiled system of how to print Judeo-Arabic. They were familiar with it. They were familiar with the orthography. So their printing was very nice. The letters were beautiful. It was all the dots were in the right place. It was very easy to read. And so that kind of printing, encouraged people more and more to use that kind of press, whereas presses that were less familiar with it made a lot of mistakes. It made it difficult to read. So, people wouldn't go back to that press. So there's a kind of, business model related influence here.
Thank you very much. Neil asked, was the Jewish community in Tunis more vibrant than the historical Jewish community in the island of Gerba?
I don't want to incite any like Gerban Tunisi rivalries here. So I'm not going to pick one or the other. I'll say that both communities were very vibrant and really central to Jewish life in Tunisia. Gerba is an interesting case because it is sort of isolated, both physically as an island and also culturally. It kind of kept to itself. And so Gerba actually became a very important center for Hebrew and Judeo-Arabic publishing, but only in the 20th century, especially in the mid-20th century. So there are Hebrew and Judeo-Arabic presses in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. In Gerba, they're the ones who really take over the bulk of Judeo-Arabic printing in Tunisia. Tunis kind of, maybe let's say Tunis peaks like closer to the turn of the century, like 1890s, 1900s, and then Tunis sort of, declines a little bit, and Gerba kind of takes over the printing industry, like maybe in the 30s, 40s period. And of course, the Gerba has a very strong, rightfully strong pride in its devotion also to the Hebrew language and to the kind of Hebrew education that they have in Gerba. But yeah, I'm not going to say one is more vibrant than the other. They're both very dear and important in Tunisian history.
Thank you. Julia asked, can you say something about the preservation of Jewish prints today, especially in Tunisia? Do you know about the situation of the archives and libraries there? What happened to the Etz Chaim Yeshiva books?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll say in general that the majority of just printed material in general and books in general, and manuscripts and printed books, was dispersed with the dispersal of Jewish communities from North Africa in the post-war, post-independence period, let's say 1948, after 56, through to the 1960s and 70s. So, of course, much of this material is now held at the National Library of Israel, at the Ben Tzvi Institute, in private collections, at other libraries, in France. There's a large Moroccan collection in Belgium, which I think I put a few objects from the Dahan collection in Brussels. In North America. To my knowledge, there is very little left in North Africa today. And I'll be honest that I did not go. Like, I did not go to Tunis, or Morocco to do research for this project specifically in the archives. It's possible that there's material there that is hiding or is just there, but I don't know about it. But to my knowledge, the majority of material has left North Africa. Now, there's sort of two different trajectories of fate for what happened to these books. For the smaller, ephemeral, the little booklets, and especially the popular Judeo-Arabic material, people kept it, and then as the younger generation didn't want it, it got dispersed. A lot of it was discarded. Some people have been collecting it. The late Avraham Atal from the Ben Tzvi Institute did a phenomenal job of collecting a lot of this rare material. The National Library has a lot of this rare material, but there are a lot of booklets. A lot of this material that I showed you survives in one copy or two copies. So there's a kind of inverse relationship that the more popular a book was, the less likely it is to have survived, because the more likely it is that people like read it and passed it around and read it until it fell apart and then discarded it. Whereas the magnificent luxury books that sold 3 copies but were preserved in very fancy libraries, those have a higher chance of survival because collectors buy them up and give them to, donate them to libraries. The rabbinic libraries, these large rabbinic libraries of sort of these very important families, the Serrero family library, the Sarfati family library, the Bahlul family library, to my knowledge, those some of those were abandoned and kind of left in North Africa and sort of have not survived. Some of them were taken by the descendants and are now in Israel or France in various places, like sort of reassigned. Like I think that I don't quote me on this, but I think some of the books from the Eitz Chaim Yeshiva in Tunis ended up at a yeshiva in Jerusalem, maybe the Ben Porat Yeshiva. I don't know. I'm actually very interested in this question, and I'm hoping to pursue it. So this material, which was part of my dissertation, is part of a book manuscript that I'm currently working on to publish. And one of the things that I want to add, which I didn't get to do in my dissertation, is try and follow a single library from North Africa that actually still survives intact or mostly intact today. So if anybody, I know there are a lot of scholars on this call of North African history, if any of you know of a particularly well-preserved North African library that is still accessible today, sort of in its entirety, I would be very interested to learn about the kinds of work we could do with cataloging it.
Thank you very much. Phyllis asked, when Jews from North Africa left for France and later to Israel, did they bring these libraries with them?
Yeah, sometimes they did and sometimes they didn't. I know that, for example, the catalog that I showed you which was of Ner Yisrael Sarfati's library, that was not brought with them. It was sort of left in Morocco. And then in the 70s and 80s, some descendants went back and tried to find it, and it had sort of fallen apart, and they rescued some books and some books were not there anymore. But other libraries were taken. The library that I mentioned from Algeria, the Sibaoun library, that was sent to France. And it was cataloged by this scholar Gerard Nahon. Unfortunately, he's passed away. He cataloged it, and then he published half the catalog, and he said he would publish the other half of the catalog, but he never did. And then he passed away just a few years ago. And I don't actually know where those books are now. When he was writing in the 80s, they were held by the Consistoire in Paris. So I've written to the Consistoire and they never wrote back. So I don't know if they're there. They're maybe in Paris somewhere, but those ended up, again, this is a magnificent library from Iran. It was like very well regarded. So they boxed it up very carefully and they sent it to France, I think in the 50s.
Thank you very much. Diane is asking for any suggestions about basic introductory material we can read on the subject.
Oh, that's I love that question. Well, you'll have to wait for my book, which is not finished yet. For an introduction for Tunis, specifically for Tunisia, there is the book that I mentioned by Yosef and Sfia Tobi called Judeo-Arabic Literature in Tunisia, 1850 to 1950. It's also in Hebrew, something like Hasifrut Aravit Yehudit Betunisia. It's a pretty straightforward title. There is also a book in Hebrew by Yosef Tedri on the book culture of Fez, HaSefer v'Hadfus HaIvri b'Fez. There's articles, but in terms of general introductions to North African book culture, that's pretty much it until I publish my book. For general introductions to book culture in general, there's a lot because it's a really burgeoning field. What I would recommend, I actually have it here on my shelf if I can spot it. There's this great book. I'll recommend two books or three books. Okay, there's The Jewish Bible, A Material History by David Stern, which is really an excellent introduction. There's this book, The Broadview Reader in Book History, which is just a general introduction to book history. And there's also Josh Teplitsky's new book, Prince of the Press, How One Collector Built History's Most Remarkable Jewish Library, which is an analysis of an Ashkenazi library, but it's a really well done introduction to how studying Jewish books as material objects can help us understand Jewish history more clearly. So those would be my recommendations. It's a great field to be in. It's a burgeoning field, Jewish book history, and I think it's an exciting new way to think about. Many people have studied Jewish books for a long time for what's in them. The texts have attracted a lot of attention, analyzing, discussing, commenting on the texts in Jewish books. But what we're doing now is to zoom out and think about even before we get to what is in the book, just the book itself as an object, who made it, who held it, who sold it, who bought it, how did it move around, what did it mean to the people who bought it and sold it and put it on their shelves or read it or didn't read it. I think there's a whole new world of understanding that books open up to us as windows into the lived experience of Jewish communities, and a broader sense of the Jewish community that is not just the elite people who usually ended up writing books, which is a sort of narrow slice of the picture, but the fuller picture of the world that these books inhabited is something that I think studying the book as a material object can help us see, and it's what's most exciting to me about the field of Jewish book history. So it's a great fun to be part of.
Thank you very much. Catherine asked, are the doodles on Nuna's contract a convention for providing clearly identified space for signing documents? Is that from a European tradition?
I'll just, I see that my colleague Yael Baruch is on the call, so I'll direct you to her incredible work on the handwriting and signatures of North African Jews. But those doodles are actually the signatures. It's a kind of elaborate, developed form of the signature, especially among North African rabbis. It's related to, there's kind of an Ottoman style of royal signature called a tughra, which is a very fancy, kind of impossible to duplicate authentication. And many Jews, especially rabbis in North Africa, developed these kind of elaborate signatures, which have a kind of set of loops and spirals that is unique to them or to their family, that are developed over the years. And so those doodles on the bottom there are the signatures of two rabbis from the Kohen Scaili family, which is a well-known family of Debdu, who were the kind of the witnesses and adjudicators of this particular contract. What's interesting is that this contract says at the bottom also that it was written in two. So you write two copies and then you split it in half, and each party gets one half of the document. So this is only one half that survives. The other half is out there. But I don't know actually what happened to Nuna's books, themselves. Like, where is this set of the Talmud? If anybody sees a set of the Talmud that has the name Nuna of Debdu inscribed on it, please let us know, because I think it would be an honor to reconnect those books. But in the meantime, they're out there somewhere. They're the traces that these books leave behind. There's a project called Footprints, which is tracking the movement of printed Hebrew books through space and time. I see some of our Footprints colleagues are here on the call, but that to me is another really powerful way of studying the book. Even if we don't have the books themselves, we can still track the footprints that they leave, the kind of traces that they leave as they pass through communities. And so this contract of Nuna's is one of those examples of there was a book here, there was a set of books here that meant something to these people. We don't know where the books are now, but we can sort of point to this moment as being an important time that they kind of surfaced.
Thank you. Michelle actually put in the website for Footprints in the chat, so if anybody wants to look that up. Deborah asked if you can send the book titles to in an email to all attendees, but Deborah, I suggest I'm going to put my email in the chat right now. You can write to me, and then I will forward the message to Dr. Sienna gladly, and then he can forward you the titles, or you can continue your correspondence. Thank you very much, Dr. Sienna. It was very, very exciting and riveting. There's many compliments in the chat. I'll send you the transcript.
Wonderful.
Thank you all very, very much. We'll see you in our next event. I'm going to open the microphones so that people can say thank you in person. Just a second. The microphones are now open.
Toda. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. It was so interesting.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Wonderful. No.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Very good. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you.
No, once again, fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Blockade of the museum. As a first step, the KGB visits the museum and tells the staff, you realize.
Well, it's wonderful to see so many friends and colleagues and family, my parents. It's great It's really great to be here with all of you.
Thank you, Noam. Bye-bye.
And everyone's, as Dawn said, anybody's happy to contact me or to contact the library if you have further questions or if I didn't get to answer your question. I'd be happy to do so.
Thank you. Your future endeavors. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you all once again. Good night from Jerusalem. Good afternoon, Dr. Sienna. We'll
It is
see you all in our
afternoon.
next event.
Yes,
Wonderful.
thank you so much. It was fabulous. Thank you.